Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he checked the power lines running along the canyon edge. The twin suns of Kepler 442b beat down mercilessly, making the metal tools almost too hot to touch. Mining Station 7 sat perched on the cliff like a metal spider, its legs dug deep into the rock face. Jake had been working on the outer maintenance grid for 3 hours, fixing damaged circuits that kept the whole operation running. The job was simple enough. Replace burnt-out power cells, check connection points, and make sure nothing would explode when they fired up the big drilling machines tomorrow. Jake liked working alone out here. No supervisors breathing down his neck. No crowds of miners arguing about shift schedules. Just him, his tools, and the endless red desert stretching toward the horizon. The mining colony was a rough place where humans worked alongside dozens of alien species. Most of them barely tolerated each other. The Xanthari kept to themselves in their temperature-controlled sections. The rock-eating Moldens only came out at night. And the Varkanians, well, they made it clear they thought humans were weak and useless. Jake was adjusting a loose cable when he heard it, a high-pitched cry echoing up from the canyon below. He stopped working and listened. There it was again. Something was definitely in trouble down there. He walked to the edge and looked over. The canyon dropped almost straight down for about 200 feet, before leveling out into a rocky slope. Halfway down on a narrow ledge barely 3 feet wide, something small and furry was moving around frantically. Jake pulled out his binoculars and focused on the ledge. His breath caught in his throat. It was a Varkanian cub, no bigger than a human 6-year-old. The little creature had thick gray fur and pointed ears that twitched with fear. It was pacing back and forth on the tiny ledge, occasionally looking up at the cliff face above and letting out those desperate cries. The cub must have fallen from somewhere higher up. Varkanians were excellent climbers, but cubs sometimes got overconfident and ended up in trouble. This one was definitely stuck. The ledge was too narrow to build up speed for a jump, and the rock face above was too smooth to climb back up. Jake looked around for any other Varkanians who might be searching for the cub. The area was empty. He checked his radio but only got static. The nearest Varkanian settlement was 50 miles away, and they rarely ventured near human mining operations. He could report it to the station and let someone else deal with it. The smart thing would be to contact the Varkanian authorities and let them handle their own. Getting involved with alien politics was a good way to lose your job or worse. But as Jake watched, the cub stumbled and almost fell off the narrow ledge. It caught itself just in time, pressing against the rock wall and shaking with terror. The little thing was exhausted and scared. It probably had been stuck there for hours. Jake made his decision. He went back to his maintenance kit and pulled out his climbing gear. Working on power lines meant carrying safety ropes, anchors, and a basic climbing harness. It was not exactly mountain rescue equipment, but it would have to do. He set up an anchor point using one of the power line supports, testing it twice to make sure it would hold his weight plus extra. The rope was rated for heavy industrial use, so that was not a problem. Jake strapped on his harness and helmet, then clipped in his emergency first aid kit. The climb down was tricky. The rock face was weathered and crumbly in places with loose stones that liked to break free and tumble into the canyon. Jake went slowly, testing each handhold and foothold before putting his full weight on it. The last thing he needed was to fall and make the situation worse. As he got closer to the ledge, the cub noticed him. It pressed itself against the far end of the narrow space, watching him with large golden eyes. Jake could see it was trembling, probably from fear as much as exhaustion. "Easy there, little guy," Jake said softly, even though he knew the cub probably did not understand human speech. "I'm here to help." The cub made a low whining sound but did not try to run. There was nowhere to go anyway. Jake carefully maneuvered himself onto the ledge. It was even narrower than it had looked from above, barely wide enough for both of them. The cub watched every move he made, ready to bolt if he came too close. "Let me take a look at you," Jake said in the same gentle tone he used with his sister's kids back on Earth. He slowly pulled out his first aid scanner and ran it over the cub from a distance. The readout showed some scrapes and bruises, but nothing broken. The little guy was lucky. The cub had cuts on its front paws from trying to climb the rough rock. Its fur was matted with dust and sweat. Jake could see it was dehydrated and probably hungry too. Moving very slowly, Jake pulled out his water bottle and held it where the cub could see it. The Varkanian's ears perked up immediately. Jake poured some water into his palm and held it out. After a long moment, the cub crept forward and lapped up the water. Its rough tongue tickled Jake's palm. When the water was gone, it looked up at him with those big golden eyes as if asking for more. "That's it, trust me a little," Jake murmured. He gave the cub more water, then carefully applied antiseptic gel to the cuts on its paws. The cub flinched but did not pull away. Now came the hard part, getting them both back up the cliff. Jake's rope was long enough, but he would have to carry the cub while climbing. He studied the little creature, trying to figure out the best way to do this safely. Varkanians were supposed to be fierce and dangerous, even as cubs. But this one just looked like a scared kid who needed help. Jake pulled off his work jacket and wrapped it around the cub like a blanket. The little thing seemed to understand what was happening and did not struggle. "Hold on tight," Jake told the cub as he clipped them both into his harness. "We're going home." The climb back up took twice as long as the trip down. The cub stayed perfectly still, as if it understood that any sudden movement could send them both falling. Jake's arms burned with effort by the time they reached the top, but they made it safely. Once they were on solid ground, Jake set the cub down and checked it over again. It seemed fine, just tired and still scared. But something had changed during the rescue. The cub was not afraid of him anymore. It stayed close to Jake, occasionally touching his leg with its small paw. Jake looked around the empty worksite and wondered what he was supposed to do now. He had rescued a Varkanian cub, but he had no idea how to contact its family or even if it had any family left. All he knew was that he could not just abandon it out here. The cub looked up at him and made a soft chirping sound that almost sounded like "thank you," in whatever language. Varkanian cub spoke. Jake smiled despite himself. "You're welcome, little guy. Now let's figure out how to get you home." Jake carried the young Varkanian cub back to Mining Station 7 as the suns began to set. The little creature had fallen asleep in his arms during the walk, exhausted from its ordeal on the cliff. Jake felt the steady rhythm of its breathing against his chest, and found himself being extra careful not to wake it up. The station's main hub was bustling with activity. As the day shift ended, and night crews prepared to take over, Jake drew more than a few stairs as he walked through the corridors carrying what everyone could clearly see was a Varkanian cub. Conversation stopped as he passed. Some workers pointed and whispered to each other. Jake ignored them and headed straight for the medical bay. Dr. Lisa Park was just finishing up with a Moldan worker, who had scraped his rocky hide on some mining equipment. She looked up as Jake entered and her eyes went wide. "Jake, what in the world?" she started, then saw the sleeping cub. "Is that what I think it is?" "Varkanian cub," Jake confirmed quietly. "Found it stuck on a ledge in the canyon. It's hurt but not badly, just some cuts and scrapes." Dr. Park had been working frontier colonies for 15 years. She had seen just about everything, but even she looked uncertain. "Jake, do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into?" "Varkanians don't exactly appreciate other species handling their young." "I couldn't just leave it there to die," Jake replied. "Besides, maybe they'll be grateful I helped." Dr. Park gave him a look that clearly said she thought he was being naive, but she gestured to an examination table. "Let's take a look at the little one. Try not to wake it up if you can help it." Jake carefully placed the cub on the soft padding. It stirred slightly but stayed asleep. Dr. Park ran her medical scanner over the small body, checking the readouts on her display. "You did good work with the first aid," she said. "The cuts are clean and properly treated. No broken bones, no internal injuries. Mostly just exhaustion and dehydration. A night's rest and some proper food should fix most of that." Before Jake could respond, an alarm chimed throughout the station. The intercom crackled to life with the voice of Station Commander Williams. "All personnel, we have incoming Varkanian vessels. 3 ships approaching fast from the northeast. All non-essential personnel report to designated safe areas immediately." Jake and Dr. Park exchanged glances. The timing could not be a coincidence. "They're here for the cub," Dr. Park said. "Jake, you need to think about this carefully. How are you going to explain why you have their child?" The cub woke up at the sound of the alarm, its golden eyes blinking in confusion. When it saw Jake, it immediately reached for him with its small paws, making soft chirping sounds. "I think it likes you," Dr. Park observed. "That might help, or it might make things worse." 20 minutes later, Jake found himself in the station's main conference room facing 3 large Varkanians in military gear. The leader was a massive male with dark gray fur marked by old battle scars. His amber eyes studied Jake with obvious suspicion. Commander Williams handled the introductions. This is Beta Commander Razak of the Territorial Guard. He's looking for a missing cub. Jake stood up, still holding the young Varkanian who refused to let go of his shirt. I found him stuck on a cliff ledge about 5 miles from here. He was hurt and scared, so I brought him back to get medical attention. Razak's ears flattened against his head as he listened to the translation device. When it finished, he spoke in rapid, growling Varkanian. The translator converted his words to standard English a moment later. Beta Commander Razak wants to know why you interfered with Varkanian business. He asked what payment you expect for this service. Jake blinked in confusion. Payment? I don't want any payment. I just couldn't leave a child in danger. The 3 Varkanians exchanged glances and spoke among themselves in their own language. Jake could not understand the words, but their body language suggested they were confused or even suspicious. Razak spoke again, his tone sharper this time. The translator rendered his words, "Nothing is done without purpose. State your true intentions." My true intention was to help, Jake said, feeling frustrated. Where I come from, you don't leave children in danger just because they're not your species. This seemed to confuse the Varkanians even more. Razak approached closer, towering over Jake. The human could smell the alien's musky scent and see the powerful muscles beneath his fur. The Beta Commander was definitely built for fighting. The cub in Jake's arms made a happy chirping sound when it saw Razak. It reached toward the large Varkanian with its small paws. Razak's expression softened slightly as he gently touched the cub's head with one clawed finger. Kes, Razak said in a much gentler tone. It was obviously the cub's name. Kes chattered at Razak in rapid Varkanian baby talk, pointing at Jake and making what sounded like excited explanations. Razak listened carefully, his scarred face showing surprise at whatever the cub was telling him. When Kes finished his story, Razak looked at Jake with a completely different expression. The suspicion was still there, but it was mixed with something else. Confusion, maybe even a hint of respect. The cub says you risked yourself to save him, the translator announced after Razak spoke. He says you fed him and made his pain go away. This is unusual behavior for a non-pack member. Jake shrugged. It's normal behavior for a human. Razak extended his arms toward Kes, clearly expecting to take the cub back. But when Kes saw what was happening, he clung tighter to Jake and made distressed whining sounds. He definitely did not want to leave. The 3 Varkanians looked shocked. Even Commander Williams raised his eyebrows. Jake felt just as surprised as everyone else. It's okay, little guy, Jake said softly to Kes. You need to go with your family now. But Kes shook his head and buried his face against Jake's shoulder, holding on with surprising strength for such a small creature. Razak spoke rapidly to his companions, clearly agitated. The translator caught fragments. Unprecedented, and pack bonds, and not natural. After several minutes of discussion, Razak approached Jake again. When he spoke, his tone was formal but not hostile. The cub has formed an attachment. This has never happened with an outsider before. According to our laws, I cannot simply take him if he does not wish to go. The trauma of separation could damage his development. Jake felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. What does that mean exactly? It means, Commander Williams interrupted, that you've accidentally become part of a very complicated political situation. Razak continued speaking through the translator. I propose a temporary arrangement. The cub will remain here while he recovers, but I will station guards to ensure his safety. You will be allowed to visit during his healing time. When he is fully recovered, we will reassess the situation. Jake nodded slowly. It seemed like a reasonable compromise. That sounds fair to me. But as Razak and his guards left to set up their temporary camp, Jake could not shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The way the other Varkanians had reacted to Kes's attachment to him suggested this kind of thing simply did not happen in their culture. Dr. Park prepared a comfortable room for Kes in the medical bay, with soft bedding and toys that some of the human families had donated. The little Varkanian seemed content as long as Jake stayed nearby. As Jake sat beside the small bed, watching Kes drift off to sleep, he wondered what he had gotten himself into. All he had wanted to do was help a child in trouble. Now he was apparently part of some unprecedented diplomatic situation that nobody seemed to understand. Kess made a small, contented sound in his sleep and reached out to touch Jake's hand with his tiny paw. Jake smiled despite his worries. Whatever complications this might cause, he knew he had made the right choice. Some things were more important than politics or cultural differences. The next morning would bring new challenges, but for now, a young Varkanian cub was safe and sound. That was enough. 3 days had passed since the Varkanian guards set up their camp outside Mining Station 7. Jake had fallen into a routine of visiting Kess in the medical bay during his breaks and after work. The young cub was healing quickly, but he still refused to go anywhere without Jake nearby. Dr. Park found the whole situation fascinating from a medical perspective. "I've never seen cross-species bonding like this," she told Jake as they watched Kess play with some building blocks. "Usually young animals only bond with their own kind, but Kess acts like you're his parent." Jake was teaching Kess how to stack the blocks into a tower when Commander Williams burst into the medical bay, looking more stressed than Jake had ever seen him. "We've got a problem," Williams announced. "A big one. Alpha Prime Theron is on his way here." Jake looked up from the blocks. "Who's Alpha Prime Theron?" "Only the most powerful Varkanian in this entire sector," Williams replied. "He commands a fleet of 12 warships and controls 3 star systems. And according to the message we just received, he's Kess's father." The building blocks scattered as Jake's hands went numb. Kess chirped in concern and patted Jake's arm with his small paw. "His father?" Jake repeated weakly. "You mean I rescued the son of their supreme leader?" "That's exactly what you did," Williams confirmed. "And he's not happy about the situation. His message was very clear. He wants to know why his son prefers the company of a human over his own pack." Dr. Park whistled softly. "Jake, you need to understand something about Varkanian culture. They believe blood bonds are everything. A cub who rejects his own pack for an outsider, that's basically unheard of. It could be seen as a sign of weakness in their bloodline." Jake felt Kess climb into his lap, still playing with the scattered blocks. The little cub had no idea that his innocent attachment was causing a political crisis. "How long until he gets here?" Jake asked. 6 hours, Williams replied. "His ship is fast and he's not wasting time." Jake spent the next few hours trying to prepare for a meeting he had no idea how to handle. He researched everything the station's computers had about Varkanian culture, and Alpha Prime Theron specifically. What he learned did not make him feel any better. Theron was described as a warrior who had never lost a battle or backed down from any challenge. He had united the scattered Varkanian clans through a combination of political skill and sheer physical dominance. Other species in the sector respected him, but they also feared him. The files included some grainy video footage of Theron from various diplomatic meetings. Jake studied the images and felt his stomach drop. The Alpha Prime was enormous, even by Varkanian standards. He stood nearly 8 feet tall with battle scars covering his dark fur and amber eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire. This was not someone Jake wanted to anger. As the appointed time approached, Jake sat with Kess in the medical bay trying to explain what was about to happen. The cub did not understand most of the words, but he seemed to sense Jake's nervousness. "Your father is coming to see you," Jake said softly. "He's going to want you to go home with him." Kess tilted his head and made a questioning sound. "I know you like staying here with me," Jake continued. "But family is important. Your real family." The cub seemed to consider this, then climbed up to hug Jake around the neck. Whatever happened, Kess was making it clear where his loyalties lay. When Alpha Prime Theron's ship landed, the entire station felt it. The massive vessel touched down with enough force to shake the buildings and send vibrations through the ground. Jake watched from a window as a ramp lowered and Theron emerged, followed by a dozen elite guards. Even at a distance, the Alpha Prime's presence was overwhelming. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never encountered anything he could not defeat or control. The other Varkanians around him seemed small by comparison. Commander Williams met Theron at the entrance, but Jake could see the human was nervous. The Alpha Prime was polite but clearly impatient. He wanted to see his son and the human who had somehow gained the cub's loyalty. Jake waited in the conference room with Kess sleeping in his arms. Dr. Park sat nearby, ready to provide medical testimony if needed. The door opened and Theron entered, his massive form filling the doorway. Up close, the Alpha Prime was even more intimidating. His amber eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that made the human feel like prey being studied by a predator. But when Theron's gaze shifted to the sleeping cub in Jake's arms, his expression softened dramatically. "Kes," Theron said quietly, his deep voice surprisingly gentle. The cub's eyes opened at the sound of his father's voice. For a moment, Jake thought Kes would run to Theron immediately. Instead, the little Varkanian looked between his father and Jake, then snuggled closer to the human. Theron's eyes narrowed, but he did not seem angry, more like puzzled. He spoke to Commander Williams, who provided translation. "Alpha Prime Theron says he wants to understand what has happened here. He asks permission to observe you and his son together." Jake nodded nervously. "Of course." For the next hour, Theron watched in silence as Jake interacted with Kes. He saw Jake feed the cub his lunch, carefully cutting the food into small pieces and making sure it was the right temperature. He watched Jake read to Kes from a children's book, using different voices for the characters even though the cub did not understand the words. When Kes got fussy and started crying, Jake did not get frustrated or impatient. Instead, he held the cub gently and spoke in soothing tones until Kes calmed down. He checked the cub's bandages and applied fresh antiseptic gel to the healing cuts. Most telling of all, Theron observed how Jake responded when Kes had a nightmare during his afternoon nap. The cub woke up crying and reaching for Jake, clearly remembering his fall from the cliff. Jake immediately comforted him, staying close until Kes felt safe enough to sleep again. Throughout all of this, Theron said nothing. But Jake could see the Alpha Prime's expression changing. The suspicion was still there, but it was mixed with something else. Confusion, certainly, but also what might have been grudging respect. When Kes woke up from his nap, he finally seemed to notice his father properly. The cub made happy sounds and reached toward Theron, who carefully picked up his son with hands that could easily crush stone, but were perfectly gentle with the small creature. Kes chattered at his father in rapid Varkanian, clearly telling him all about his adventures with Jake. Theron listened patiently, occasionally glancing at Jake with an unreadable expression. After Kes finished his story, Theron spoke to Commander Williams again. The translation came a moment later. "Alpha Prime Theron says he has never seen anything like this. In Varkanian culture, cubs bond only with pack members. Outsiders are either ignored or treated as enemies. But his son clearly trusts you completely." Jake cleared his throat nervously. "I just tried to take care of him the way any child should be cared for." Theron's ears perked up at the translation of Jake's words. He handed Kes back to Jake and spoke again, his tone more thoughtful now. He asked what you mean by any child, the translation provided. He wants to know if you would do this for any young creature regardless of species. "Of course," Jake replied without hesitation. "A child is a child. They all need protection and care." This answer seemed to surprise Theron more than anything else that had happened. He stared at Jake for a long moment, then spoke rapidly to his guards in his own language. Jake could not understand the words, but he could tell they were discussing something important. Finally, Theron turned back to Commander Williams and spoke formally. The translation came through clearly. "Alpha Prime Theron says he needs time to consider what he has observed here. He will remain on the station for 3 more days to study this situation further. He asks that you continue caring for his son during this time, so he can better understand human behavior." Jake felt a mixture of relief and continued nervousness. He had passed some kind of test, but clearly there were more to come. As Theron prepared to leave, Kes reached out to his father again. This time, when Theron took him, the cub did not cry or struggle. He seemed content to be held by either Jake or his father, as if he had decided both were safe. The Alpha Prime studied his son's face, then looked at Jake one more time. When he spoke, his tone was softer than before. He says, "Thank you," the translator provided, "for saving his son's life and for treating him with kindness. He says this is a debt that must be acknowledged." After Theron left, Jake sat in the empty conference room feeling emotionally drained. Dr. Park patted his shoulder sympathetically. "I think that went better than it could have," she said. "At least he didn't challenge you to single combat." Jake managed a weak smile. The day is still young, but deep down he felt like something important had happened in that room. Theron had not just been observing Kes. He had been studying Jake, trying to understand what kind of person would risk his life for an alien child and then care for that child as if it were his own. Whatever. Conclusion. The Alpha Prime reached over the next 3 days would determine not just Kes's future, but possibly the relationship between humans and Varkanians throughout the sector. No pressure at all. Alpha Prime. Theron spent 2 days observing Jake and Kes together, always watching from a distance but never interfering. Jake tried to act natural, but it was hard to ignore the massive Varkanian leader studying his every move like a scientist examining an interesting specimen. On the 3rd day, everything changed. Jake was in Maintenance Tunnel C with Kes, showing the young cub how the power distribution systems worked. Kes loved watching the colored lights on the control panels and listening to Jake explain how electricity flowed through the station. It was their usual afternoon activity, and Jake had started to relax despite Theron's constant observation. The explosion came without warning. One moment Jake was pointing out different circuits to an interested Kes, and the next moment the tunnel filled with smoke and the sound of cracking rock. Emergency lights flashed red as an automated voice announced, "Structural collapse in Maintenance Tunnel C. All personnel evacuate immediately." Jake's training kicked in instantly. He scooped up Kes and ran toward the tunnel entrance, but chunks of ceiling were already falling. A massive piece of reinforced concrete crashed down right in front of the exit, completely blocking their escape route. "The other exit," Jake muttered, turning to run in the opposite direction. But more debris was falling from the ceiling, and cracks were spreading along the walls. Whatever had caused this collapse, it was getting worse fast. Jake found an alcove that seemed more stable than the rest of the tunnel, and pressed himself against the wall with Kes held tightly in his arms. The little cub was crying from fear, but Jake barely heard him over the sound of the station's structure tearing itself apart around them. His mind raced through possible escape routes. The main tunnel was blocked. The emergency exits were probably buried under tons of rock by now. The ventilation shafts might be big enough for Kes, but not for an adult human. That gave Jake an idea. A terrible, desperate idea, but the only one he could think of. He pulled out his emergency communicator and switched to the general broadcast frequency. "This is Jake Morrison in Maintenance Tunnel C. The tunnel has collapsed and we're trapped. I'm with the Varkanian cub Kes. I need someone to access ventilation shaft 7C from the outside." Static filled the channel for a moment before Commander Williams's voice came through. "Jake, we're working on rescue operations. The whole section is unstable. It might take hours to dig you out safely." Jake looked up at the ceiling where new cracks were appearing every few seconds. "We don't have hours, Commander. The shaft is our only option. Jake, that shaft is barely big enough for the cub." "You won't fit." "I know," Jake replied quietly, "but Kes will." In the background of the radio transmission, Jake could hear Theron's deep voice speaking rapidly in Varkanian. Commander Williams translated, "Alpha Prime Theron says his guards are already moving to access the ventilation system. But Jake, you need to understand what you're suggesting. If you put the cub in that shaft alone," Jake understood perfectly. "If something went wrong, if Kes got stuck or scared and could not make it to the other end, the little cub would die alone in the dark. And Jake would die knowing he had failed to protect the child who trusted him completely. But staying here meant they would both die for certain. At least this way, Kes had a chance." Another section of ceiling collapsed nearby, sending dust and debris flying. Kes buried his face against Jake's shoulder and whimpered in terror. "It's okay, little guy," Jake said softly, though his own hands were shaking. "I'm going to get you out of here." Jake carried Kes to where ventilation shaft 7C connected to the tunnel. The access panel had been knocked loose by the collapse, revealing a narrow opening that led up into darkness. Jake could hear voices echoing from the other end, probably the rescue team getting into position. He knelt down and looked into Kes's golden eyes. The cub was scared but still trusted Jake completely. That trust made what Jake had to do both easier and infinitely harder. "Listen to me very carefully," Jake said in the gentlest voice he could manage. "You need to go through this tunnel. Your daddy is waiting for you on the other side." Kes looked at the dark opening and shook his head, clinging tighter to Jake. "I know you're scared," Jake continued, "but you're very brave, remember? You survived falling off that cliff. You can do this too." Jake lifted Kes up to the opening. The cub fit easily, but he refused to let go of Jake's shirt. "I'll be right behind you," Jake lied, hoping Kes could not tell. "Just crawl toward the voices. Your daddy is calling for you." Indeed, Theron's voice was echoing down the shaft, speaking in soothing Varkanian that even Jake found comforting. Kess perked up at the sound of his father's voice but still did not want to leave Jake. The decision was made for them when another massive chunk of ceiling fell, missing them by inches. Jake realized they were out of time. "Go," Jake shouted, pushing Kess into the shaft. "Go to your daddy." Kess disappeared into the darkness, his small cries echoing back down the tunnel. Jake could hear him crawling away, moving toward safety and toward his father's voice calling to him. Jake sat back against the wall and tried not to think about what would happen next. The tunnel was collapsing around him and rescue teams could not reach him in time. But Kess was safe. That was what mattered. He activated his communicator one more time. "Commander Kess is in the shaft. Make sure someone catches him when he gets to the other end." "Jake, we're not giving up on you," Williams replied. "Theron's people have some kind of emergency equipment. They think they can stabilize your section long enough to—" The transmission cut off as another section of the tunnel came down. Jake closed his eyes and tried to stay calm. He had done everything he could. Kess would make it to safety and that was enough. But apparently Alpha Prime Theron had different ideas. The sound of massive claws tearing through metal echoed through the collapsed tunnel. Jake opened his eyes to see Theron literally ripping apart the blocked entrance with his bare hands, his enormous strength making short work of the concrete and steel that would have taken rescue teams hours to clear. Behind Theron came a squad of Varkanian guards with emergency support equipment. They moved with military precision, setting up structural supports and clearing debris at incredible speed. "Impossible," Jake whispered. "No one should have been able to break through that much wreckage so quickly." Theron reached Jake just as the ceiling above them started to sag dangerously. Without hesitation, the Alpha Prime grabbed Jake and threw him toward the tunnel entrance while simultaneously bracing the falling concrete with his own body. Jake hit the ground hard but uninjured, just as tons of rock came crashing down where he had been sitting. Theron roared in pain and effort as the full weight of the collapse settled on his shoulders. But he did not move from his position protecting the escape route. The Varkanian guards reached their leader and quickly deployed emergency supports to take the weight off him. Within minutes, they had stabilized the tunnel enough for everyone to escape safely. Jake found himself outside the collapsed section, covered in dust, and barely able to believe he was still alive. Kess ran to him immediately, chattering excitedly in Varkanian and showing no signs of trauma from his crawl through the ventilation shaft. Dr. Park checked both Jake and Kess for injuries while Alpha Prime Theron stood nearby, his fur gray with dust and his right arm hanging at an odd angle. The massive Varkanian had dislocated his shoulder bearing the weight of the collapsing tunnel, but he seemed unconcerned with his own pain. "Why?" Jake asked when he finally found his voice. "Why did you risk yourself to save me?" Theron looked at him for a long moment before speaking. Commander Williams translated his words. "He says he watched you choose to save his son even when it meant you would probably die. He says anyone who would make that choice for a child not of their own blood deserves the same choice to be made for them." Jake stared at the Alpha Prime in amazement. "You could have been killed." Theron's response came through the translator with what Jake could swear was a hint of amusement. "He says Varkanians are harder to kill than that. And he says he wanted to understand what kind of courage humans possess. Now he knows." As the medical teams worked on Theron's shoulder, Jake sat with Kess and tried to process what had just happened. The Alpha Prime had not just saved Jake's life. He had deliberately put himself in mortal danger to do it, just as Jake had done for Kess. It was a test, Jake realized. Theron had wanted to see if Jake's concern for Kess was genuine, or just some kind of political manipulation. When Jake chose to send Kess to safety even though it meant his own death, it proved something to the Alpha Prime. But what Theron had done in return proved something else entirely. It showed that the capacity for selfless courage was not unique to humans. It existed in Varkanians too, at least in their greatest leader. Kess curled up in Jake's lap, completely content now that both his human friend and his father were safe. The little cub had no idea that his rescue had sparked something much larger than anyone had expected. As Jake watched Dr. Park finish treating Theron's shoulder, he had the strange feeling that everything was about to change, not just for him and Kess but for humans and Varkanians throughout the entire sector. The Alpha Prime had taken notice indeed, and apparently he liked what he saw. The ceremony took place 1 week after the tunnel collapse in the main assembly hall of Mining Station 7. Jake had never seen so many different species gathered in one place. Humans, Varkanians, Xanthari Moldans, and representatives from a dozen other alien civilizations filled the large room to witness something that had never happened before in recorded galactic history. Jake stood at the front of the hall wearing his best civilian clothes, which still felt inadequate for such an important occasion. Beside him, Kes fidgeted in a small formal robe that made him look like a tiny Varkanian noble. The little cub kept reaching for Jake's hand, still preferring the human's company even though his father stood nearby. Alpha Prime. Theron dominated the center of the room, his massive form draped in ceremonial armor that marked him as the supreme leader of the Varkanian Territorial Alliance. His right arm was still in a medical brace from the tunnel collapse, but he carried himself with the same commanding presence that had made him legendary throughout the sector. Commander Williams served as the official translator, though Jake suspected Theron understood more human speech than he let on. The Alpha Prime had spent the past week learning about human culture and customs, just as Jake had tried to understand Varkanian traditions. Citizens of all species, Theron began, his deep voice carrying easily through the hall. We gather today to witness something that our ancestors believed was impossible. We gather to welcome a human into the Varkanian pack. A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. Even though everyone knew what was about to happen, hearing it stated officially still seemed incredible. Jake's mind drifted back to the conversation he had with Theron 3 days earlier. The Alpha Prime had explained the significance of what he was offering. In all our history, Theron had said through the translator, pack membership has been limited to those born Varkanian. Our laws, our traditions, our very identity is built around the concept of blood bonds, but you have shown that bonds of choice can be just as strong as bonds of birth. Jake had tried to protest that he was just an ordinary maintenance engineer who had done what anyone would do, but Theron had cut him off. No, the Alpha Prime had said firmly. Not anyone would risk their life for a child of another species. Not anyone would choose certain death to save one small cub, and not anyone would earn the complete trust of a Varkanian young in just a few days. You have demonstrated courage, selflessness, and honor. These are the qualities that define true pack membership. Now standing before hundreds of witnesses, Jake felt the weight of that honor. Theron continued the ceremony, speaking in formal Varkanian that the translators rendered into multiple languages simultaneously. Jake Morrison of Earth, Theron declared, you saved the life of my son when he was in mortal danger. You cared for him as if he were your own blood. You chose his safety over your own survival. By these actions, you have proven yourself worthy of the highest honor our people can bestow. Theron approached Jake, carrying an ornate silver collar inlaid with precious stones. It was beautiful, but Jake could see it was also functional. The collar contained translation devices, emergency beacons, and what looked like some kind of identification technology. This collar marks you as an honorary alpha of the Varkanian people, Theron explained as he placed it around Jake's neck. It grants you the right to speak for our people, to call upon our aid, and to be treated as family by any Varkanian you encounter. It also makes you responsible for upholding our honor and protecting our young. The collar was heavier than Jake had expected, but it felt warm against his skin. Almost immediately, he could hear the Varkanian conversations around the room without needing translation. The collar's technology was integrating with his nervous system, giving him the ability to understand and speak the Varkanian language. I accept this honor, Jake said, the words coming out in fluent Varkanian to his own amazement, and I promise to prove worthy of the trust you have placed in me. The assembled Varkanians let out a collective howl of approval that made the station's walls vibrate. Even the other species in the audience seemed impressed by the display of acceptance. But the ceremony was not finished. Theron knelt down and picked up Kes, who had been watching the proceedings with wide golden eyes. My son, Theron said in Varkanian, you have chosen this human as your pack brother. Do you understand what this means? Kes nodded solemnly, though Jake suspected the cub did not fully grasp the political implications of his choice. To Kes, Jake was simply the person who had saved him and cared for him. The rest was just adult stuff. Then let it be recorded, Theron declared, that Kes, son of Theron, has claimed Jake Morrison as his pack brother. May their bond bring strength to both our peoples. Kes immediately ran to Jake and hugged his legs, chattering happily in Varkanian about how excited he was. Jake picked up the little cub and held him close, still amazed that this small creature had started such a dramatic change in interspecies relations. After the formal ceremony ended, the real celebration began. The station's cafeteria had been transformed into a feast hall, with foods from dozens of different worlds laid out on long tables. Jake found himself surrounded by diplomats, scientists, and military officials from multiple species, all wanting to understand how this unprecedented alliance had come about. The political implications are staggering, Dr. Lisa Park said, as she joined Jake at one of the tables. The Varkanian Territorial Alliance controls 3 star systems and commands one of the most powerful fleets in this sector. Having them as official allies could change everything for human expansion into frontier territories. Jake watched Kess playing with some human children who had come to the station for the ceremony. The little Varkanian was teaching them simple words in his language while they showed him human games. To them it was just fun. They had no idea they were participating in the first real cultural exchange between their species. "I never wanted to be a diplomat," Jake admitted. "I just wanted to help a kid who was in trouble." "Sometimes the best diplomats are the ones who never wanted the job," Commander Williams observed as he joined their conversation. "Theron has already contacted Earth's colonial authority. They want to establish formal relations with the Varkanian Alliance, and they want you to be part of the negotiating team." Jake nearly choked on his drink. "Me? I'm a maintenance engineer." "You're also the only human who's ever been accepted into a Varkanian pack," Williams pointed out. "That makes you uniquely qualified to help our species understand each other." As the evening wore on, Jake found himself in conversation with representatives from other alien species who were interested in establishing similar relationships with humanity. The Zinthari were curious about human child-rearing practices. The Moldans wanted to understand human concepts of honor and duty. Even some species Jake had never heard of were asking questions about human culture and values. It seemed that Jake's simple act of kindness had demonstrated something about humanity that other species found both surprising and admirable: the willingness to help others regardless of species, the ability to form emotional bonds across biological differences, the courage to sacrifice for those who could not protect themselves. These were qualities that many alien civilizations had not expected to find in humans. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had departed, Jake sat in the observation lounge with Theron and Kess. The little cub had fallen asleep between them, exhausted from all the excitement. "What happens now?" Jake asked in his newly acquired Varkanian. Theron considered the question carefully. "Now we learn from each other," he replied. "My people have always believed that strength comes from dominance and territorial control. But you have shown us a different kind of strength. The strength that comes from protecting others and building connections across differences." The Alpha Prime looked out at the stars visible through the observation windows. "The galaxy is changing, Jake Morrison. New territories are being explored. New species are being encountered. The old ways of dealing with others, through fear and intimidation, may no longer be sufficient. Perhaps it is time for the Varkanians to learn new ways." Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The collar around his neck was more than just a symbol of honor. It was a bridge between 2 very different species, and he was expected to help both sides cross that bridge safely. "I'll do my best," Jake promised, "but I'm going to need help. This is bigger than anything I ever imagined." Theron smiled, showing impressive teeth. "You will have all the help you need. The Varkanian Alliance stands behind you, as does the growing community of humans and aliens who believe in what you have started here." As if to prove his point, Kess stirred in his sleep and reached out to touch both Jake and his father, holding on to them both. The little cub had found a way to be part of 2 families at once, and perhaps that was exactly what the galaxy needed. 6 months later, the first joint human Varkanian colony was established on a frontier world designated New Haven. Jake served as its chief engineer and cultural liaison, helping to design a settlement where both species could live and work together. Theron provided military protection and administrative support, ensuring that the colony would be safe from the various threats that plagued